The functionality we are creating today is the Firebase Listener function. The purpose of the Firebase Listener function is to listen for any changes detected on Firebase and apply those changes to the iOS application to hide or show the button. We will now add the new functionality. So type in the following: func fetch Firebase remote config hide and show listener button. This function will now accept a closure called show button at escaping bool. Next thing we need to do is to add an update listener for the Firebase remote config. Remote config dot remote config add config update listener. That's the completion handler we need to use. Config update error in the next thing we need to do is to check to see if the config update is nil by using the guard statement. The update should be a capital U. Error equals nil, else. So what this does, if there's an error or the config update is nil, then we will use our defaults, which is false, to show the actual button on the screen, and then we return out of the guard statement. After line 76, the next thing we need to do is to check if the updated keys includes the actual keys for hiding or showing the button. If config update keys contains Firebase config hide or show button raw value. So the raw value is this value here. So if this key exists in Firebase that we created, I think it was the last tutorial, the previous tutorial, then we need to get the latest value of that key. So we type in let remote, and the latest value of the key will either be true or false. Let remote config equals remote config dot remote config. So that value will be either to show or hide the button on the view. Let config value equals remote config value for key, which is Firebase config hide or show button raw value. Let hide button value equals exclamation mark config value dot bool value. The purpose of that is to invert the boolean value, for example, flip the boolean value. The next thing we need to do is to activate the updated configuration. So we type in remote config dot remote that should be a capital R for remote config. Remote config should be capital R. Remote config activate changed error in. Let's open our closure. And that shouldn't be active, that should be activate on lines 84. Next thing we need to do is to check to make sure the error that there's no error. So if there was an error, within show button, that will be false. But if there wasn't any error, then we just return whatever value we receive from Firebase remote config. So this value will be to hide or show the button on the view. But that should be dispatch queue main async. Just compile it. Another thing we need to do is within the Firebase app file, which is this one here, within our main app file or main project file, which is Firebase real-time remote config app. Also need to initialize Firebase. So we do that after line 13. Just create an initializer. And then we just type in Firebase app configure. So what that does, it gets Firebase ready to perform all the operations that we want it to perform, and call the methods and other attributes that we need to use within the application. I'll just compile it. In next week's lesson, we will start to implement the content view so that Firebase can interact with the view to hide and show the button based on the config value of true and false that will be retrieved from Firebase. Thank you for joining us. If you found this tutorial helpful, please comment, like and subscribe. See you next week.